The state of war is, most simply put, a situation of force being used without right. State of nature is people interacting peaceably under the law of nature without a government regulating their relations. The state of war is a state of war between two or more individuals, where force is being utilized without the right to use that force. To put it slightly differently, Locke says the state of war is any intentional inroad into another person's property or a design to put another person under one's arbitrary power. So you can see here there's a component of intentionality to this. The state of war cannot happen by accident. And secondly, you see that two things are being violated here. One of two things. And really, these are almost synonymous formulations for Locke. There's a violation of property rights, or there's a violation of your autonomy. You're being, somebody is attempting to force you under their arbitrary power. Okay. Locke says that violations of the natural law can be punished with death. You remember, Locke said that there is a natural law, that even when there is no government in sight, even in places and times where government hasn't even been imagined or invented yet, there is a natural law regulating all relationships in the state of nature. And for Locke, having a law without punishments attached to violation of the law doesn't really make much sense. And Locke wants to go quite far with this. He wants to say that the death penalty is justified in certain cases where the law of nature is violated. So, in Locke's way of thinking, the state of nature has got aggressors, people who break the law of nature, people who try and harm others in their life, health, liberties, and possessions. And there are people who are aggressed against. They're the victims of the aggressors. They're the people whose property is being intentionally invaded. They're the people who are whom are the victims of aggressors trying to put them under arbitrary power. And Locke says, you can resist a thief who tries to take your property in the state of nature. You can punish them with death if it comes to that. And what Locke is thinking is, okay, let's say there are two people in the state of nature. Only thing governing them is God's will and the natural law. One of these people runs up to the other, he's got a knife, and says, your purse, your money, or your life. According to Locke, the first thing we'll notice about this hypothetical scenario is Locke thinks there was money in the state of nature. This is an interesting idea. I'll elaborate on it next week. But for now, just grant that there's money in the state of nature, that you don't need a government to have money. Okay, so Locke says, if I'm being aggressed against, if I'm the victim in the situation, I don't know how far this thief will go. The thief is willing to violate my property rights. Who's to say this thief will respect my bodily integrity? Who's to say that after I hand this thief my money, this thief will not actually just kill me anyways? Who knows? They're a lawbreaker. They don't respect the law. They don't respect the natural law. And who's to say after I hand over the money, the thief doesn't try and force me to labor for them later on. In other words, try and force me into slavery. I don't know. It's a slippery slope. This is a lawbreaker. It's an emergency situation. There's no such thing as a police force. There's no government I can call on for help. There's nobody else around. And so when it comes down to it, Locke says, you actually have the right to kill a thief who only intends to take your property, and you are justified in killing that thief according to the law of nature, because the law of nature, once again, entails the right to punish violations of the law of nature. So, to sum up, Locke thinks there is a clear distinction, a difference as clear as the difference between night and day, between the state of nature and the state of war. Locke says, in the state of nature, you've got individuals who are interacting peacefully without a government. In the state of war, Locke says, you've got the use of force without right. And this is interesting, both where there is and there is not a common government. So the state of war scenario where I had two people just running into each other in some neck of the state of nature, say out in the woods, wandering in the woods, or in a huge plain or something like that. That's the case of the state of war where there is not a common government. Neither of those people in that hypothetical scenario accepted that a government had the right to govern their relationship. Why? Because in that hypothetical scenario, we just said, imagine there is no government. Okay. But Locke says there's actually a more complicated and a more interesting case. And this is what Locke is really after. And we'll see this over the next couple lectures. What Locke is saying is, if there is a conflict where a people and its government are in controversy, and if it comes down to a kind of civil war with the people on one hand and the government, a tyrannical government, on the other, Locke is saying there's actually a state of war between the people and their government. And somebody probably used force without right. And in Locke's way of thinking, it's probably the tyrannical government. Okay, so there can be states of war between a people and their government. Okay, and that's where Locke's going with this argument. So it's very important that he's going to establish that there is a death penalty, and it's very important for Locke that there is a state of war, even in cases where the government is one of the parties to that war. Property in the state of nature. That's the first topic of today's lecture. Natural limits of property. That's the second topic. So Locke's idea is property exists in the state of nature, and that you can accumulate property in the state of nature. However, you cannot accumulate property without limits. There are clearly, Locke thinks, natural limits on how much stuff, how much material possession that you can accumulate within the boundaries of the natural law. Now, before we arrive at that conclusion, let's talk about what property is for Locke. Locke has got two senses of property. The first is very expansive, and it's pretty much anything that can be owned. Anything that an individual can lay a claim to. That's the broadest sense of property. So, your life is your property. Your health is your property. Your liberties are your property. If you say, I have a right to something, that's your right. Your estates or your lands are your property. If you say, this is my estate, you're laying a claim to it. You're saying, I have title to this land. And similarly, Locke says, your possessions are your property. So in the state of nature scenario, we're being stolen from, that money was yours. You had a legitimate claim to that money. And that's basically why the thief saying, give me your money, was an illegitimate and an aggressive act. Okay, so property is anything you can put a personal pronoun before. If I can say my blank, my life, my liberty, my estates, my possessions, if I can put that my on it, and I've got a real claim under the natural law, or in a different case, under a government, then that's my property. Anything ownable, basically. Anything ownable, including myself. Including myself. My life, I own me. I own my body. Okay. Chapter 5 is about property in a restricted sense and in a restrictive case. What Locke is keen on doing in chapter 5 is establishing that material property exists in the state of nature. Material property is not so much life and liberty. Those are a little bit more intangible. Material property means estates and possessions, the last two bits here on this list of things that can be owned. Okay, Locke is saying that estates and possessions can be legitimately owned and the subject of property rights in the state of nature, in a condition without government. Property for Locke is private. Public property is, for Locke, an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms. Property is owned by individuals. That's another way of putting it. Only individuals own property. And it derives its character of private from the fact that if you're the owner of something, you have the right to exclude other people from its usage. You have, as it were, final say over what happens to your property, so long as your usage of your property does not harm other people. Okay, so if you want to take the example in the state of nature, remember we were talking about how Locke thinks you can basically get a plot of land, work on that plot of land, grow food on that plot of land, build a house on that plot of land, food, clothe, and shelter yourself on your property, your estate. Let's say it's a small estate. This is a state of nature, a very rudimentary level of technology and so forth. That means you've established a title to your land. And if somebody comes onto your lawn, let's call it, and you don't want them on the lawn, you have the right to say you are excluded from this property. You cannot use this property to walk on. You have to back off. Okay, and of course, according to Locke, if they don't respect your request, if they don't respect your property rights, you have the right to punish them and so forth. Okay, so ownership gives you the right to exclude others from your property's usage. Another way that private property is a redundant formulation, another way that all property is private, is Locke doesn't think that there's a such thing as public property. What we would call public property is what Locke calls the commons. And the commons just means some land, usually referred to common land. This is how it was used in 17th century England. Common land that anyone had the right to access, anyone had the right to use, anyone had the right to walk through, to come and go as they pleased. So, Locke says, in fact, you don't have to wait until 17th century England to have commons. In fact, Locke says, and here now he's tapping on his Christian beliefs and his Christian heritage, he says, God gave the entire world to humankind in common. In the beginning, it was all commons. It was all commons, and the entirety of the earth was just open access. This was before people started parceling out land, for example, into private property. Locke does think you can start parceling out land into private property. Locke does think you can start taking stuff off the land and making it your private property. So property is natural in the sense that you can establish titles and establish legitimate ownership in the state of nature. You don't need a government around with property law. You don't need courts around to enforce your property rights. In a situation long before government, thousands of years before government, doesn't matter how long actually, as long as there's no government, you can still own private property in the state of nature. And remember, having no government is the defining characteristic of the condition of nature, the state of nature. Property is also natural in the sense that you can secure property according to the natural law. So what establishes your title in that property in the state of nature? Locke would say, obviously, it's the natural law because there's nothing else to authorize it. Remember, the natural law says the species must be preserved. Species must be preserved. And Locke's reasoning is, by preserving yourself, by providing for your own health, for example, by sheltering yourself from the natural elements and so forth, you are fulfilling the natural law. So the ultimate justification of private property is that it actually helps the species endure, that it helps the species survive, and therefore is in line with God's intentions. So in a common sense way, what Locke is really saying is God wants us to have private property because God wants us to survive. Okay, so if there's no government around and there's no magistrate or public official that says, oh yeah, that's your property, here you go, how do you get this property? Well, Locke says you can actually do that solely in a interaction between one individual and the natural world. You don't need a third individual. You don't need some magistrate. You don't even need another human being. You can secure property under the law of nature without the consent or without the agreement of anybody else. That property is yours. How do you establish that title? Just in a relationship between you and some and the natural environment. How would you do that? Locke claims the answer is very simple, and it boils down to labor. What establishes property, as well as the value of that property, is labor. Another way of putting this point is labor is the reason that anything is owned in the state of nature. And labor is the reason that anything in that state of nature is worth owning. So labor is the source of two things: title and value. Title and value. Labor is extremely important for Locke. The funny thing about labor for Locke is it's actually kind of unpleasant. Labor is not glorified in Locke. If you read today's chapter, chapter 5, you'll notice that Locke actually says labor is a kind of commandment, or it's a kind of that's actually a kind of punishment. After humanity was thrown outside of the Garden of Eden, we don't need to get into that. The idea is then there was labor and toil and hard work. Okay, and so when God says you've got to subdue the earth and you've got to make the world more habitable for humankind, that's acknowledging, yeah, labor has to be commanded because it's not actually pleasant. Labor is toil and kind of miserable, and it takes effort, and you get exhausted, and labor is just like, it's hard. So labor is not actually inherently pleasant. If anything, Locke thinks that labor is inherently unpleasant, and he talks about the pains of labor and labor pains and taking the trouble to labor and all this kind of phraseology. So why do we do it? Well, we do it because, first of all, labor establishes property, and property helps us survive. So we do it because we have to, in a way. Locke thinks that the rewards of labor are the entire point of laboring, because labor, once again, is not inherently pleasant. It's not something people get addicted to and so forth, at least not in Locke's imagination. They do it for the rewards. They do it because they can survive. They do it because they can have the conveniences of life. They do it because the things that they make with their labor are more worth owning than things that just fall from the sky or fall from a tree. Okay, so labor, despite its importance, has an instrumental justification. Do you remember this distinction we had in Plato? Some things are inherently good, and some things are good because they get us other things that are good. Labor falls into that second category. It's not inherently good. It's more like it helps us get things that we actually want. Labor gives an unquestionable title. This is Locke's phrase, unquestionable title in the state of nature. And there's a caveat here, prior to money, and we'll see what that caveat's about probably next week. So Locke says, imagine that there's an individual in the state of nature eating some roasted and seasoned acorns. When did those roasted and they're bringing the acorn right up to their mouth? They eat the acorn. When did that acorn become the acorns owned by that individual? When did that acorn become the individual's private property? Was it when they put the thing in their mouth and started chewing? Was it at the point of consumption? Do you have to wait until the acorns are digested and so forth? No, Locke says. The moment that individual started putting labor into those acorns, they began establishing title to it. And the more labor they put into that acorn, the more they had a claim to that acorn, the more they had a claim that acorn was their private property. And therefore, the more they had the right to exclude other people from the acorn's usage. So imagine this. Two people see some acorns on the ground. They're in the same neck of the state of nature. They both see the acorns on the ground. The only labor that's been involved is looking at the acorns. Neither really has a firm right to those acorns. Neither has a firm claim to those acorns. However, if one person picks up the acorns, is in the process of picking up the acorns, and another people runs over and says, oh, no, I saw those first. I saw those first. Those are mine. Locke would say, no, actually, no. It's the first person's acorn because they started working on it. And the more that person washed the acorns and put the acorns over a fire and cracked the shells and poured seasoning into it, the more they labored on it, the more they had a right to those acorns. Locke would also use this acorn eating example to show that the acorns, after they'd been worked upon for hours and hours, were actually more valuable and actually more useful to all of humankind. Not just the one who's going to enjoy the use of it, but to anyone. You're objectively putting value into those acorns. That's how Locke would think about it. And you do it precisely through your labor. This is, for those of you who know your history of economic thought, you know this is called the labor theory of value. Labor theory of value. The idea is labor is what is the ultimate source of value for all products or commodities. Okay, that's a side note. We'll come back to this labor theory of value when we talk about Karl Marx. But labor is what gives any natural product its value. So this acorn snack is way more valuable, Locke would say, than an acorn that just fell on the ground. You can't even eat that acorn that just fell on the ground. Okay, and imagine, here's another scenario. Instead of waiting for acorns to just fall on the ground, imagine you started an acorn tree grove, and you just cultivated the acorns, and you bred the acorn trees, and pretty soon you had like an acorn farm. Locke's reasoning is, isn't that land way more valuable? Isn't it 100 times, 1,000 times? So Locke is using this kind of hyperbolic rhetoric, but you get the point. He's saying it's 100 times more valuable than any, quote, wasteland, any land that is not being utilized, any land that is not being labored upon. Okay, so labor is not inherently good, but labor is good because it produces value. Okay, so that's the gist of what Locke is saying about labor. We'll notice here that, especially on this labor is what establishes title, labor is what establishes property, the question of accumulation, the question of building up more and more property naturally arises. So property is natural. You can accumulate property just by working on it. And so if you work a lot, Locke says, in the state of nature, you're going to have more property. However, Locke doesn't think that you can just keep accumulating property without limits. There are natural limits on property, and natural limits here means limits imposed in the state of nature by God. Natural limits are set by natural law. So think of it like this. Locke said that liberty in the state of nature is limited. It's limited by the law. A liberty that does not respect natural rights, in other words, natural limits, is not liberty, it's license. So your liberty to accumulate property, your freedom to pursue property is limited, just like all liberties are limited. The moment that your pursuit of property goes from healthy to perverse, and you are actually harming people in your accumulation of property, Locke says you've crossed the limit. Your accumulation of property is no longer legitimate. You've violated a kind of natural boundary. So Locke is not saying anything special about your liberty to accumulate property or property rights. Like all liberties and rights, Locke thinks there have to be limits. There have to be limits, and these limits are not set by humankind, they are set by God. And they are encoded in the natural law. Locke thinks there are two clear limits. The first limit is you can't accumulate more goods than you can use. The second is you can't take goods that others need. Let's call the first limit the no spoilage limit, and the second limit the ensure surplus limit. So let's go back to the hypothetical state of nature and somebody who likes eating acorns. Let's imagine our acorn lover goes beyond just eating the acorns. They actually want to hoard the acorns. They have some weird fascination with acorns. And so in their on their front lawn, they start piling acorns up. And every morning, this acorn-obsessed individual gets up, runs out into the woods all around, and starts snatching up the acorns. And then it gets early and earlier. He's doing it at midnight. He's doing it at all hours of the day. And he's piling up these acorns. Okay. If his neighbors come by and they see this huge pile of acorns that is just sky high, and there's more acorns than this acorn lover could ever eat, and some of that acorn is just rotting. There's mold growing on it. There's insects crawling through it, or whatever. Squirrels, who knows? There's something wrong there, Locke would say, and there's obviously something wrong there, because if the justification of property was it helps us survive and labor gives us useful things in life, this is a clear violation. This is some weird performance art. Who knows what this is? This is some weird perversion. This guy getting off on a huge pile of acorns. Who knows what this is? Clearly, something is violated. So Locke says, especially when it comes to goods that are spoilable, that can spoil, rot basically, there's a clear limit. Everyone can see it. There's acorns rotting on this guy's lawn. Okay, so a natural limit has been violated. Now imagine, let's go from bad to worse. So the acorns are rotting on that guy's lawn. Now imagine, Locke would say, that there's a famine going because acorns are the main source of food in this neck of the state of nature. And other people need to eat acorns. And there's not a lot of other plants or not a lot of other food you can really forage for. So let's imagine this is like, yeah, before agriculture and so forth. Okay. You are actually actively harming your neighbors when you are out there hoarding the acorns that they need to eat to help them survive. You are actually violating the law of nature when you ensure that there is nothing left over for your neighbors to eat. And this is why I've called it the ensure surplus limit. You can only accumulate up to the point that there's good enough and plenty, that's Locke's language, good enough and plenty left over for other individuals to actually work on themselves. Okay, so you can't take what others need to survive. And if your neighbors are all skinny and looking ragged and hungry, and you've got this huge pile of acorns, something has clearly gone wrong. You have accumulated too many acorns. Here's another way of putting it. Those acorns really aren't yours. You violated the natural law. That's not your legitimate property, Locke says. So you can see in this acorn owning set of examples, because really there are a couple scenarios I ran through, the main point is that property is a question of distinguishing what's mine and what's yours. Distinguishing what acorns are the acorn lovers and what acorns his neighbors have a right to claim as well, maybe on the basis of need. And Locke would say there's a clear distinction between two kinds of people. So this is where Locke is getting into the different types of people. Interestingly, Plato is a point of contrast here. So Plato thinks there are basically three types of people. Locke basically says there are two types of people. And Locke's type of person, the big question is, are they industrious and rational? That on the one hand, or are they quarrelsome and contentious? So industrious just means you don't mind hard work as long as you can reap the rewards. You don't shy away from labor. In fact, you do your duty and you labor, you work hard every day. Rational just means you use your reason to realize that even though there's no law books with the natural law written down on it, and you're in the state of nature and perhaps you can't even read, you still realize that there is a natural law and that the natural law says don't harm other people. You see that as a reasonable restriction on your liberty, and you act reasonably when you act in accordance with that natural law. I will preserve myself and not do anything that will harm other people's abilities to preserve themselves. That's an industrial rationalist person, basically, according to Locke. I'm not trying to mess with your property. I'm just trying to do my own thing, accumulate property for myself, stay within the natural limits. The quarrelsome and contentious, well, you can see by implication they're neither industrious nor rational, and it's all about arguing. It's all about not wanting to work and wanting to argue over stuff that other people have legitimately accumulated. So a quarrelsome and contentious person, instead of saying, well, how can I earn some acorns for myself, says, how can I take acorns from other people? And then cook up some rationalization or some justification for that thievery. Quarrelsome and contentious person doesn't want to respect the boundaries between the different lawns or the different estates in the state of nature. Quarrelsome and contentious person is always going to try and find some excuse to extend their property and take property away from other people. Okay, so both types of people are really all about property. And the big question is, are they relating to their property in a healthy way and in a legitimate way, or are they relating to property in an illegitimate way in a kind of predatory and aggressive way. Okay, so the idea of Locke here is in the state of nature, if you've got the state of nature, people will be basically minding their own business and doing their daily labor and staying within the bounds of the natural law. Whereas the state of war arises when a quarrelsome and contentious person tries to use force without right, tries to use force to take what isn't theirs. And so they're basically a thief or a criminal.